profile, which encompasses a lot of different things, which we'll talk about.
You just mentioned sensory-motor control. And in our realm, particularly in physio, the word...
Why is it that we smile as soon as we say that?
Because we always have issues with things because we think that people say things and use terminology that we believe they don't really understand what they're saying.
Yeah.
And motor control is one. That seems to be a catch-all term for utilization of segments of movement, different types of movement, the quality of the movement, muscle activation, patterning, all these kind of things, but it's often not used correctly. And I know that the term that you tend to give a lot of feedback to our staff here and people that are understanding is really starting to get an idea of sensory motor control. So do you want to give our listeners maybe an understanding of what sensory motor control is? Because if you look into the literature and the body of literature, they don't talk about motor control a lot. It seems to be something that gets talked about in physical therapy, but they talk about sensory motor control. And what's the difference and what actually is it?
Well, it encompasses not just the output of the system, i.e. motor, but also the input of the system.
And look, I think this is something that if you look at neurobiology, this is something that they've been talking about for a long time. This idea that perception, and whether you're thinking about that from a psychological standpoint, like I watched something actually only the other day that was looking at perception and how we don't actually see objects, we see meaning. And I think that that's a really important factor because it significantly alters what we do in terms of our response. And I think that's probably part of the crux of what you're getting at is you need to be able to sense what is going on before you can appropriately react or create some sort of motor learning.
Well, I think you also highlighted a valuable point is even sensory motor control, we need to be careful of not reducing it down to thinking that this is like a purely bidirectional response of like input output, because the reality is there are so many factors along the way that determine how you interpret that input in terms of integrative factors. So like, executive function, your mood, your arousal, neurotransmitter status, things like that. And there's a lot of environmental factors there too, because the behavior of the sensory motor system is going to be dependent on the context of your environment. So whether you're in like a closed environment, say, running in here is going to be very different to running in the final of Olympic race.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because I know that like in the past, and for people interested, I think some of the work of Paul Glazier is very relevant with this. He talks very much around the interaction that occurs, within the organism. And in that paper, particularly the one about like unified sort of theory, he talks a lot about the idea that the environment has a really big influence on what actually the output will be.
Yeah, and Daniel Walpert talks a lot about this too.
I know you brought up Daniel a lot. I think for our listeners, there's some really good videos. Is it on YouTube or is
He's got a few on YouTube. Yeah.
There's one on, is it even a TED Talk?
There is a TED Talk as well.
Yeah. All of those I think are really relevant and valuable for people because he starts to really put together these pieces, as you said, of like the interplay and not just this information going in, but what's actually happening within the different parts of, say, the nervous system for that interpretation to even occur.
And extending beyond this simplified idea of it's just purely an engineering problem of like a circuitry thing that you can
it's like this wire connects to this wire. It's not that.
It's a bioengineering problem. And what I mean by that is, we're not simple systems. We're actually quite complex systems. And we've talked a little bit about this before, but we need to essentially look at the sensory motor system as a confluence of factors that are interacting with each other in a dynamic fashion that creates changes over time. And that makes a lot of sense when you just even think about how you felt when you woke up this morning affects your movement patterns compared to yesterday, compared to tomorrow, because of, you're deprived in sleep. You've maybe had a few drinks last night.
Yeah. And this is the thing, it doesn't necessarily mean the output is diminished. It's just that our sensory feedback that we're getting is different. And it sometimes will cause a decrease. It might sometimes also cause an increase. But I think some of the really basic examples you would give is, especially if we go back to our example from running, if it's a nice sunny day and it's a moderate temperature, you feel very, very good about how you're going to approach that situation and the output that you're going to give.
Absolutely.
If it's -2, like you said it was to me this morning when you rolled out, in the car, it's a very different proposition to how you're going to approach it. And the motor output that you will give is going to be heavily influenced by that temperature and environmental